Dan Balz is the chief correspondent at the Washington Post. He has covered every presidential campaign and midterm election since 1978. He's also the author of 4 books and is a regular panelist on PBS's Washington Week. So Dan, you've covered over 21 national political conventions and you've written extensively about domestic politics for a long time. What sparked your interest in political journalism?
A couple of things. One was just getting interested in journalism. I started, I guess you would call serious journalism as a college newspaper reporter. Started that my sophomore year at the University of Illinois. I grew up in Northwest Illinois and went to the U of I. And started to work for the student paper and very much enjoyed the entire sort of environment of being in a news environment and a newspaper. At that point, it wasn't so much political reporting that drew me. It was simply to be out there covering the news as it was happening. This was back in the 60s, so there was a lot happening. I mean, there was the civil rights movement, and later, during my junior and senior years at college, Vietnam, obviously. A couple of other things sparked it. One was a summer internship in Washington. I had an internship on Capitol Hill working for my local congressperson, and that got me attracted to being in Washington as a reporter. And then I would say the third thing was reading Theodore White's The Making of the President in 1960, which is just a classic work which still stands the test of time. It's one of the best political books that I've ever read. And I think that combination kind of spurred me to want to do it. But again, when I started in Washington as a reporter, it was not covering politics. I covered economic policy for a magazine called National Journal. And so in a funny way, I kind of stumbled into covering politics, but when I stumbled into it, I really liked it, and so have kept at it.
Mm-hmm. Having lived through the divisive times of the 60s and 70s, and still covering today in what is now a very polarized state, what's unique about the divisions the country is facing today from your perspective as a political reporter?
I think the divisions today are reflective of much broader changes that are going on in the country. I think the degree to which we are polarized politically reflects what I would call this division within the country of those who are comfortable with the changes that we're going through and people who are far less comfortable with them, with people who want to embrace a kind of a different sense of what America is, and people who fear that if we go too far, we lose an essential part of what the character of the country has been. And so I think that the political divisions reflect that. And as we kind of get through that long period of change, it's technological change, it's economic change, and certainly demographic change, until we get through that, we can't kind of settle some of these differences that we have politically.
In your recent article on the gubernatorial races, you stated that the GOP sort of dominates the state level politics. What do you think is at the root of this domination by the Republican Party at the state level?
It's a really good question and not easy to answer. I mean, I think one of the underreported stories of this period is what has happened to the Democratic Party. I mean, in many superficial ways, this should be a time when the Democrats would be prospering as the country changes. Younger voters are more attached to the Democratic Party. There's more younger voters. A lot of different aspects of what we are seeing. And nonetheless, the Republicans have found a way, both through, I would say, skillful campaigns, but also by finding attractive candidates to dominate, not just in Washington, but in the states. I mean, we're at a point today where the Republicans have, 34 of the 50 governors. The Democrats are at a low point. The Democrats took terrible beatings in the 2010 and 2014 midterm elections at the congressional level, at the gubernatorial level, at the state legislative level. And so I think that the notion that the election of President Obama ushered in kind of a new liberal era turned out to be a mistaken assumption on the part of a lot of Democrats, and now they're kind of in a hole and they're going to have to fight their way back.
You spoke a little bit about Republicans choosing good candidates, attractive candidates. Looking ahead to 2020 with the presidential election especially, what characteristics or what kinds of candidates should the Democrats be looking for?
Well, I think the Democrats are going to have to find a candidate who can, in a couple of ways, stitch together what is a somewhat divided Democratic Party. There's so much focus on the obvious divisions within the Republican Party, and yet, as you noted, they have prospered in spite of that. The Democrats think they are very united, and yet they have suffered in spite of that. And so I expect that in 2020 we're going to see a very, very large field of prospective candidates. I mean, you could draw up a list today of a dozen or more, dozen and a half people who are probably seriously thinking about whether they should run. We may see a field of Democrats in 2020 similar to that we saw in 2016 among the Republicans when they had, 16, 17 candidates. But I think a couple of things. I think one thing that the Democrats have to decide, and that will be decided through the nomination battle, is do they want somebody of, in a sense, my generation, or do they want somebody from a new generation, a fresh generation, to lead them forward? So that's going to be one big question. I think another is, do they go in the direction that Bernie Sanders has charted, which is to move demonstrably to the left, or do they pull it back in some way to what you would call a center-left message? And I think the third big challenge that they have to have, or that they have to meet, is to find an overarching vision for the many things which they advocate. Secretary Clinton had many, many white papers. She had many things that she wanted to do. She had a programmatic solution to all kinds of problems. But in one way or another, she was unable to put that together in a larger and more positive vision that people could hang on to. Donald Trump's "Make America Great" slogan was easy to remember. It was harder to remember exactly what it was that Secretary Clinton was standing for. And I think that's always a challenge for a presidential candidate. You can know where you stand on healthcare or education or foreign policy, but how you appeal broadly to the country is a much bigger question.
Looking back to Bernie Sanders' impact in 2016, how do you see Sanders? What role do you see him playing moving ahead to 2020, if he plays a role at all in the presidential election?
Well, I think he is certainly going to play a role. I don't know that will be as a candidate or not, and I think that's a decision he will be making closer to the time when you have to decide whether you're going to run or not. But in many ways, he is a leading, if not the leading voice within the party in terms of kind of defining the issue terrain. I mean, he's the one who's put Medicare for all legislation on the table, around which there is now going to be a debate within the Democratic Party. Is that the way they want to go? Is that where they want to kind of attach themselves, or is there some other idea on health care that other Democrats may use to compete? But Sanders is laying down a series of markers that, in one way or another, I think everybody who is thinking of running for president is going to have to deal with and respond to, and decide where they stand on that and what unique approach they might have in comparison to that.
You spoke a little bit about some of Clinton's failures during the 2016 campaign. What do you think the campaign could have done better, or that could have increased its chances of defeating Donald Trump in 2016?
Well, I don't think there's any one thing. I mean, when you lose by as narrowly as she lost Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania, you could cite 25 things that might have been done, small things or large things. I would say that there were a couple of factors that certainly contributed to it. One is, again, her inability to go beyond a message of Donald Trump is not qualified to be president and to attach something more positive to that. I mean, I know I wrote about it, lots of people wrote about it from the very beginning of her campaign, that one question she had to answer. Look, she was as well known and in many ways as well prepared as anybody who's run for president. And yet there were questions about her. There were questions about what she really stood for, why she really wanted to be president. And she struggled, I thought, throughout the campaign to address that. I think the other aspect of that is that she struggled to have a kind of an authentic voice. People who know her, who've worked with her, think the world of her. And they say there is a side to Hillary Clinton that the public never sees, a more relaxed side, a funnier side. She had trouble making that available to people on the campaign trail. And I think that that's always a problem for candidates. Candidates in this day and age tend to be very guarded for understandable reasons. But if you can't project that kind of authentic human side in a time when people want to feel and look at a candidate in a personal way, you have to be able to do that. Now, in her book, she writes about what the James Comey letter at the end of the campaign did in terms of changing the dynamic of the campaign in the last 10 days. That certainly had some impact. We're only now beginning to understand and still don't fully understand the interference of the Russians in the campaign. But putting those aside, there are things on her campaign that they didn't do. And I think there were mechanical issues that they didn't do as well as they thought they were going to be able to do.
What do you mean when you say mechanical issues? What do you mean by that?
Well, there's a debate kind of within Democratic circles of whether they put too much emphasis on kind of data analytics, metrics, and things like that, did not put enough attention into old-fashioned organizing in the way that it had been done prior to this era of analytics in politics. I mean, the Obama people brought that to the forefront in 2008 and particularly in 2012. And I think that in some ways it redefined for people how you have to run a national campaign. But I think what the Clinton people found and demonstrated was that there are limits to that as well, and that they probably had put too much trust in kind of that, that I don't know what it would be, that in a sense that kind of antiseptic notion of how you figure out where you are in a campaign, and perhaps not as much on the human side as they needed.
In 2008 and 2012, the Obama campaigns were well known for sort of being at the forefront of using the internet as a tool for political organizing. And in 2016, Trump sort of mastered that in a way. What was different about the Trump's campaign approach to campaigning on the internet versus Obama's in 2008 and 2012?
I don't know that I fully understand the main differences, although I think that the Trump campaign was doing it under the radar in a way that the Obama campaign wasn't. I mean, I think everybody understood that the Obama campaign, to the extent to which they were trying to maximize the use of social media, I think people underestimated what the Trump campaign was doing, in part because the Trump campaign was a very small operation. I mean, he won the nomination with a core team of half a dozen people. That's unheard of in American politics. And in the general election, they obviously had a much bigger operation, but it was in a sense behind the curtain. I think they made use of social media in ways that they were able to go directly, even more so than the Obama people, directly at potential voters with very, very tailored messages. And we've learned a little bit about that since the campaign, but they were quite good at that. And I think the Clinton team recognized afterwards that they had underestimated what the Trump operation was doing and how successful it might be.
You've been vocal in your criticisms of Trump's rhetoric on Twitter, and journalists are known for responding to that on social media as well. To what extent should journalists assert their political opinions on social media in response to the president's tweets?
Well, when I've been critical of the president's rhetoric on Twitter, it's been in the stories I've written as opposed to the use of Twitter. I think that Twitter is a fabulous medium for understanding what's happening in real time. I mean, in a sense, it's kind of a news ticker. You learn things about what's breaking faster on Twitter than on any other medium that we have available. But I think that reporters need to be very careful about how far they go on Twitter. I mean, Twitter is a seductive medium, but it's also one in which there tends to be a kind of a conversation among friends, people talking to one another, as opposed to thinking about the broader public. And I think that some of what goes on in Twitter now, reporters probably should pull back on. I think it's one thing to, in a sense, say Donald Trump has done, look at these tweets he's done today, as I did over the weekend. What was he thinking about the tweets he did on Puerto Rico and the San Juan mayor? But Twitter unfortunately encourages people to be snarky, and I think that when you're reporting as opposed to being an opinion writer, you need to maintain some distance back from that particular line.
The Washington Post changed their slogan recently to "Democracy dies in darkness" earlier in the year, which some viewed as a bit ominous. How does this new slogan fit into the Post's changing role in wider American media?
Well, I don't know that the Post's role has changed. I mean, I think people may look at it as a changing role. I think the Post, I've been there, several decades, and to me, the Washington Post is today what it has always been and what it's supposed to be, which is a very big, robust news gathering operation that has what you would call legitimately an adversarial relationship with those in power. There's not a president who has appreciated fully the Washington Post coverage of his White House. Obviously the role that the Washington Post played in Watergate is, symbolic of kind of hard-hitting journalism and what it can mean for the country. But we've covered all presidents in a tough-minded way, and I think we're trying to do that with Donald Trump. I think the difference is the degree to which the president and some of the people around him have tried to delegitimize serious news organizations, what you could call mainstream news organizations or legacy news organizations or whatever you want to call it. And I think that's an unfortunate turn of events. And Marty Barron, who's our editor, said at one point, after there was charges that, that the White House is at war with the press and all of that, Marty's view was, we're not at war, we're at work. And we're trying to continue to do the work that we have always done. We recognize that it's a much more challenging time. I can't think of a more challenging time for journalism or a more essential time for the kind of journalism that the Post and other really good news organizations have practiced and are continuing to practice. I think that the new slogan is simply a way of reminding people of the importance of a free press in a democracy.
So looking ahead to 2020, given Trump's low approval ratings recently and some of the strife between him and the Republican establishment, do you possibly see a Republican challenger to Trump in the 2020 election?
I certainly don't rule it out. It would be a difficult challenge. The president has, any sitting president has many more assets than a challenger. But what we've learned from a succession of presidential campaigns is that presidents who get a primary challenge in their reelection campaign often go into the general election wounded. That happened to George H.W. Bush when Pat Buchanan mounted a challenge. It happened to Jimmy Carter when Senator Kennedy challenged him in 1980. They often prevail in the primary, but they can struggle in the general election. Donald Trump will have a very difficult re-election campaign. He's a divisive figure. His approval ratings are low. But the one thing we learned about Donald Trump in 2015 and 2016 is that he's able to survive situations that most politicians cannot. And so I think in that sense, you can't measure him by traditional measures. His approval rating is historically low, but it does not mean he could not get reelected.
Very good. Well, thank you for your time. I really appreciate this, Owen.
Thank you.
That's about it. This has been an interview with Dan Balz. For more articles, please visit www.harvardpolitics.com.